It's a welcome back from me. Absolutely delighted to be hosting this panel on sort of women's sport and a big focus on sort of women's cricket. Over sort of the last few years, we've seen the phenomenal rise of just women's sports globally, be it sort of football, rugby, cricket. Tennis has obviously always been up there, and Billie Jean King has been kind of leading the way for women's sports for several decades now, and it feels like we're coming to kind of the peak of the opportunity, and it will only continue to sort of be unleashed from there. So to start the conversation today, Dhiraj, you have obviously been around cricket in India for many, many years, and the WPL in its sort of inaugural year has had phenomenal success. What, from your experience that you have kind of garnered from your years of experience, have you seen sort of impact the launch of the WPL, and sort of where do you kind of see those learnings going in the future?
Thank you. Well, you know, the WPL, before even a ball was bowled, was the second most valuable women's league in the world after the WNBA. So I think the next rights, whenever that happens in 5 years, I think it will either be number one or would have really scaled to much higher heights. I've been watching the growth of women's cricket for a long time. I remember 2007 was the first men's T20 World Cup, and women's was first time played in 2009. The 2009 edition, 10, 12, 14, 16 was all played at the back of the men's cricket. So you had the women playing at a smaller venues. You had only three matches being televised, which was the semi-finals and the finals. And look at it today. You have a standalone tournament, packed stadiums, every match being televised, every match of the Women's World Cup being televised. Even the qualifiers are being televised on ICC TV. So the sport has only grown. Coming back to WPL, I guess we'd seen the experience I was fortunate enough to be part of the IPL in its very first year, and we knew what we wanted out of the game and the league at that point of time. And I think BCCI's rationale was the same with the WPL. Everybody, all the franchises, the one who bid and even the ones who didn't, I think there were 22 bidders, very serious bidders. They'd all done their homework, and I see women's sport really growing with the WPL. Every league, if you look at the Big Bash, you look at the 100, you look at any league, they do have the women's. But I think WPL has just taken everyone's imagination. You've got the best players in the world, you've got the great broadcast deal, you've got great sponsors. Thank you, sir. And it's just come across as, apart from just being a carnival of cricket, it's become really serious sport. And I see and you look at the result in the national team. Our women's have played the finals in the last 4-5 World Cup. We made it to 3 finals, and I only see the sport and the game going stronger, both financially as well as the quality of cricket that will be played.
I'm going to ask the question to sort of both Natalie and Annesha, because you sort of come from, I guess, the media side. And one of the things that is important for the growth of any sport is obviously the exposure and coverage that it receives in order to kind of get to the existing eyeballs, but also kind of sort of extending its reach. Being on kind of the broadcast and media side, what impact have you seen kind of being part of that sort of channel, and where do you kind of see the opportunity for media and kind of yourself more as kind of an influencer in that space going?
Well, this is quite an opportune moment for me to touch upon that, because for the longest part of my career, I've been a journalist. I'm still a journalist. I work as a producer as well. And all the fellow panelists of mine I have here, I have asked questions of them, and they've been very kind, and I've reported on the women's game through their insights. So thanks to them for making women's cricket accessible through their perspective, first things first, which is very important when it comes to the narrative around visibility. Because if you look at the WPL was launched earlier this year, but starting mid or early 2021, there was a sudden emergence of ads, movies around women cricketers, either featuring women cricketers or depicting female cricketers. out of the blue, there came an ad where a young female cricketer was seen wowing an MS Dhoni with her skills in a Boost ad. And I'm pretty sure very many audience members in the room remembers the recreation of the Cadbury Dairy Milk 1993 iconic ad, which came up in 2021 with a gender flip where the woman was being wowed thanks to her cricketing skills again. So there has been a change in narrative, a cultural shift, which has forced brands, media persons to take note of the ground realities and change the discourse around, well, women's sport, women's cricket. I would rather have some light tidbit on a Virat Kohli than talk about Smriti Mandhana scoring 100 on in domestic cricket. That has changed in recent years. And thanks to the WPL, I had a first-hand experience of how there was a growing appetite of storytellers with expertise on women's cricket. Delhi Capitals, Mumbai Indians, all of their media managers reached out to storytellers in the market who could shoot or did have a knowledge on women's cricket, especially female, because having a female social media content creator in a women's cricket dressing room does make a difference to a man being present in that dressing room. Better qualitative results and quantitative results as well. And as far as driving the media coverage, the call has to come from the high end of the newsroom, and editorial calls have changed over time. Have we reached where we need to be? Not just yet. A lot still needs to be done, and that is where the success of a WPL, the Women's 100 in the UK, the sustained success of the WBBL comes into play, because the more you see the numbers being generated, the happier it makes the advertisers, and the happier it makes the editors as well. So it's a work in progress. While the WPL has made a splash, it's been one of the most important and heartening story in women's cricket in 2023, which has been a tectonic, a seismic year. The ICC equalized prize money for all men's and women's events before even FIFA did. I was covering the FIFA Women's World Cup in Australia, perhaps the only traveling journalist, and there too I could see that when the announcement was made by the ICC, it was just a couple of days from the start of the Women's Football World Cup, and people did take note of the ICC's decision, because our sport, cricket, is not as far spread out as football is, but people are taking note of cricket, and now it's gotten the Olympic cachet as well. So it's great signs, and I'm pretty sure the coverage, the visibility of women's cricket will also continue to grow alongside.
I will pass to Natalie. One of the points that you sort of referenced there was the sort of the nuance around being able to have female creators and journalists as part of that journey, being able to kind of get closer to kind of the players and the action. And so, Natalie, in your kind of feedback and input as a journalist yourself, I'd love for you just to talk a little bit about the importance of females being present in female sport, particularly from a media perspective.
So if I draw on my own personal experience as well, if I think of my commentary career started in 2005, but it was actually only in 2017 where it kind of exploded in many ways, because I was asked to work on the ICC Women's World Cup, which was in England. Originally, the World Cup was only actually going to be covered, 10 games were going to be covered on TV, and they changed it to covering all the games. And what that meant was, obviously, you need now a much bigger commentary team, and I got asked to work on it. And from there on in, my career has absolutely exploded. And what that means to me is that games are being covered, but people obviously have an appetite for the game itself. And we are seeing more and more of the women's events obviously being covered as well. And it gave me an opportunity to work alongside other women's commentators, female journalists as well, and also content producers, directors, everything. It gives you that opportunity to work alongside other women that are within the industry. And I think it's incredibly important to have women working within the industry in any of the roles, because one, obviously, they bring a sort of personality to it that maybe a man doesn't bring. They bring an understanding that maybe a man doesn't bring. And I think also even former players, for example, will understand what goes on within a dressing room, on the field, because the women's game, as much as we want it to have even access, the women's game has its own personality, and it is something a little bit on the different side. So I think it's incredibly important to have women working within the industry, because they bring something that is different, they bring something that maybe an understanding in many ways. So what has resulted in the last, since probably 2017, where we had the full coverage of that World Cup, is this explosion of women within the industry, how they are working, whether it be in front of camera or behind camera as well. And they're adding something that is incredibly important to the coverage to make sure that it also reaches the right audiences as well.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Harish into the conversation because Harish is at Tata, and Tata have backed the WPL in its first year. That's kind of it was a big statement. It was a bold move. What was the kind of the driving force behind the decision to kind of really back sort of the WPL?
So that's an interesting question. You know, I want to give you a little bit of historical context to that, why Tata does something like this. Firstly, it's our privilege to be the title sponsor to WPL from its inaugural year. But the history of the Tata Group actually goes back 155 years. And our association with sport in India goes back more than a century. Our second chairman, Dhiraj Tata, was responsible for India's entry into the Summer Olympics in 1920. He funded the first Indian team to go to the Summer Olympics, and he was a very, very charismatic cricketer, but also very, very avid sports person himself. I'm told in 1916, when the Indian Gymkhana opened in London, the first multi-ethnic cricket club in London, within a few years, by 1922 or 1923, his wife, Lady Meherbai Tata, became the first woman member of the Indian Gymkhana, much before, women were permitted to other cricket clubs in the world. So there's a very, very long history with sport that the Tata Group have of pioneering sport and supporting sport. When it comes to the WPL, we have been observing women's cricket very closely in the country. And it was very clear to us that this is going to be a transformative moment for women's sport in the country, not just women's cricket. One of my colleagues, I remember, called me from the group and said, Harish, this is something that we should support because it is going to be transformative for women's sport in the country. And you know him. You've spoken to me about him as well. Therefore, there are two criteria based on which we decided to move forward. One is, I think, supporting women's sport and supporting women's cricket is the right thing to do for India, the right thing to do for the world of sport and the world of cricket. And second, we also took a bet that the viewership would be very high. And what transpired, exactly like all of you said, what transpired bore out that belief. Because at the end of the WPL, more than 100 million people in the country had watched WPL on television. 51 million in the first week, 61 million in the second week. I don't remember the exact statistics, but that just makes it the most watched, not just the most watched women's tournament, but the second most watched sports tournament in the country. So that's the kind of, that's the kind of mileage that a brand like Tata has also derived from being the title sponsor of WPL.
So you talked kind of like that halo impact in terms of kind of the growing audiences, getting sort of new fans and consumers into the game. Anish, as a journalist, but as a content creator as well, can you talk to kind of the different mediums that become really important to developing that engagement and understanding? We've talked to kind of the different types of screens and ways into engagement, but obviously women's sport, we know kind of the stickiness and the way you create those conversations need to be different. And I'd love to hear from someone that's at the coalface of developing what that content is.
Sure. So I usually write in my bios, I'm a multimedia journalist, which means I work in all three media. But in a digital-first world, the importance of social media is unquestionable. If I may look back on the 2017 World Cup, which already has been spoken about by both Natalie and Harish, that was the first instance where Twitter, and I know a certain Anish Madani who was moderating the previous panel, one of the Twitter bosses when it comes to marketing and social media, he was overseeing that particular project during the 2017 Women's ODI World Cup in England. Twitter rolled out what was a world first for women's sport on Twitter in terms of having custom emojis for captains. And do you know when was the next instance that happened? It was in the lead up to the WPL in the form of a precursor, a prelude of a tournament that was known as the Women's T20 Challenge. We talk about protagonists and lead actors, right? We should not forget the peripheral characters. And in this case, the Women's T20 Challenge, which started out as an exhibition match here in Mumbai at the Wankhede Stadium, where the final of the 2011 World Cup took place. The semi-final is going to take place tomorrow. Lots of legacy to that ground. In that May afternoon in 2018, some of the biggest names of women's cricket from England, Australia, New Zealand, India came together to play that one-off match in sweltering heat. And that was also the time when Twitter rolled out custom emojis for the two captains. So that was one of the incidents which stuck in my consciousness, because when you're studying media trends and trying to gauge the importance of social media, the narrative is, sort of unparalleled, because it was through the 2017 World Cup and how ICC's digital team made players or made heroes out of players during that World Cup. India finished runners-up. Sure, India's population, 1.4 billion people, always does help, whether getting more footfall on the ground or getting more views on the digital ecosystem. So the more we have such stories made accessible, made available for viewers, for users to consume on social media, the more options we create for the visibility of the practitioners of the sport to rise. And in that case, FIFA has done well. I've worked as a social media video producer for FIFA during the Under-17 Women's World Cup that was played in India, with Navi Mumbai hosting the finals, Spain taking on France. Well, Spain won that match, if I'm not mistaken. And there too, you could see that the larger narrative, the larger communication that was happening was through social media, through FIFA's social media channels. And when it comes to cricket, over time, if you also look at how several of the WBBL clubs chose to take off their women's only social media handles and merge them with the existing men's BBL handles, that made a lot of difference, because you already had an existing base of followers running into millions to tap into. So when it comes to driving the conversation around growing the women's game, attracting newer audiences, I don't think there's a better platform than social media. And all global governing bodies in today's day and age are going out of their way. They understand the need and the importance. Sure, there are payoffs, dividends for them to gain as well, but it's definitely helping the cause of women's cricket as well.
And Harish, from a Tata perspective, how are you using social media to engage with your customers and audiences within sort of cricket to help sort of support the game?
So, we've used social media in many ways. For instance, with Tata WPL, we had two participating brands this year, Tata Capital and Tata Motors. Tata Capital actually made a beautiful film celebrating the spirit of women's cricket. I wish I could show it here, but all of you can see it on your mobiles and YouTube. That film was on social media. It received a lot of love and affection from people who saw it. But the Tata Motors handle, the Tata Capital handle, the Tata handle, group handle, all of us, I think, looked at promoting posts, celebrating Tata WPL. We had a Tata Motors car at the stadium each day, the Tata Safari dark version. That was on social media. That was celebrated by commentators, but also by people in general. We had it was called the Best Striker of the Match award. And we had that that celebrated on social media as well. So social media was used extensively by us, but not just social media. We also used conventional media like television to talk about Tata WPL itself.
Yeah. And Dhiraj, when we look to kind of like the game itself and how it's kind of broadcast and coverage, what has the approach been to kind of differentiate from the men's game in terms of building the narrative that is more bespoke to the women's game, and how has that sort of been approached by the WPL?
Well, when we got the team in the beginning, we were not sure as to, with the men it's very easy. The statistics are available easily, the kind of data you have on men's cricket. But slowly what we did was we got the experts of women's game involved, and but our approach was not very different from what we did for the men, because I thought, what we thought was that it'll be, the WPL is as much in demand as the IPL. So we had the same amount of coaches, we had the same amount of the physios, the trainers, everything was the same, our budgets were the same. Also, as you said, social media. For us, we had 12 people shadowing the team. Our content for WPL was, in fact, more in demand than for the men's. I mean, we had great singers and dancers, so we could show what was behind the scenes, not just what's happening at the match. We had a lot of sponsors coming in just to take our content. And and having an IPL team and, being Delhi Capitals before that, Delhi Daredevils, running the team for 12 years, 8, they knew exactly what was in store. So we didn't change the basic when it came to that. We had the same approach in everything. It's just what was really heartening to see was the passion. We were not expecting the kind of passion that the fans got, that the team got. Our social media suddenly was all about women's cricket, was all about promotion of the game. That was very heartening. We were not expecting even the stadiums. You come to know the popularity of all of us working in cricket, the popularity of a tournament is the number of tickets you get asked for. And, I mean, men's is always crazy. Tomorrow's game, half of ICC will be switching off their phones. For WPL, I was shocked as the amount of tickets we played all our games in Bombay, so it wasn't even that we were playing at home. But the kind of people who were calling us, sponsors, even a lot of the men sponsors were saying, we want to be part of this, we want to experience it. And we actually struggled. We struggled to provide the tickets to everybody. We thought, and I remember, we thought that, we get X number of tickets and there wouldn't be that much demand. But I don't know, all of you came, stadiums were full. So there was no approach was not different at all. I think it was, because I don't think there was any difference. Even the quality of cricket was fantastic. I mean, you were more technical, but the switch hits, which wasn't there earlier in the women's game. The women's game earlier was very standard. Like I felt like a Natalie. I think her square drive is the most perfect square drive because it's by the book, right? And that's how women's cricket was always perceived as, that it's played by the book, But now it's innovation. They're clearing the boundary more easily. There's more power. It's a more power game and elegance as well. So our approach was not different at all. To sum it up.
Okay, Natalie, from a commentary perspective, do you take a different sort of stance or, point of view or a narrative and storytelling from how you approach the men's game to the women's game?
It's an interesting question because I think the important thing is to note that it's still cricket. I think a lot of people say, okay, we must now separate it and say it's men's cricket, it's women's cricket, and it's a different game. It's not a different game, it's still cricket. And I agree with you, the game has changed in that it's become more professional. And the power game has changed. As you said, there's a little bit more creativeness in the shots. You'll see certainly from a skills perspective, it has changed. But that's because it's become professional. And it allows women now to work on those skills, whereas before, there was never that time to do it. So from a commentator's perspective, the main thing that we try and do for the women's game is tell the stories. Because there's not a lot of people that may know all of the stories of the women's game. Many people can tell you the story of the men's Ashes and when it first started. There's some that don't even know there is a women's Ashes. So I think it's important to tell the stories that are behind it. Even within this tournament, Glenn Maxwell makes a double hundred. Everyone's talking about the double hundred, which was absolutely sensational and ridiculous what he did. But you'll hear people saying that's the first double hundred by an Australian. And in a World Cup, it's not. Belinda Clark did it in 1997. And it's because these stories haven't necessarily been told. So I think it's quite important to get these stories out there, the history of the game, because what that does, it makes people also buy into the game itself. You start forming loyalties. You start forming heroes as well. And when we start forming heroes within the women's game, that's when you start getting more and more eyes on the game, and you certainly get more and more women involved in the game too, whether it be as a player, which is obviously one of the major goals. You want to grow that base, but at the same time, you want people working on it behind the scenes or in front of camera, whatever it may be. So it's incredibly important for me, I think, to make sure that you're I don't want to say educating, because you don't want it to sound like people don't know about the game, but you want to make sure that those stories obviously get out there as well.
Yeah. And I think that builds on a couple of pieces. One, for many of you that out there that do or don't know, there is a website called Correct the Internet. The internet, the data is fueled generally by a lot of men's sports information and statistics. And, you know, to your point, Natalie, like there are many, many women that have achieved greater and firsts compared to kind of men in sort of the sporting sphere, and therefore ensuring that right information out there is kind of critically important. That leads me on to kind of like the role of sort of influencers, and it's kind of an open question to sort of the panel, but having the cricketers themselves, sort of the external influencers, the coaches that can all kind of have a role and presence. I'd love to kind of hear from a brand perspective the role that a brand ambassador plays for you within the business. And then in terms of kind of reaching kind of a new audience, the role and the importance of brand ambassadors.
Well, every drop in the ocean does count, no matter how big the ocean is. And when it comes to cricketers being influencers themselves, that's immense, because if you've watched a Smriti Mandhana play on the field of play, it's not only as a viewer do you stand a chance to get inspired, potentially as a competitor from an associate nation, which has happened time and again, especially during tournaments like the Asia Cup, where you have a Thailand or some of the lesser-known teams getting an opportunity to rub shoulders, play against much higher-ranked opposition members. There is a transference of skills that happens. And more often than not, you will find digital creators being alert of the opportunity it has, the potential it has to make an imprint on the wider audience, to a girl in Mumbai, in Lonavala, in Calcutta, in Bangkok, playing cricket, wanting to play the game at the highest level. When that girl sees a Harmanpreet Kaur taking a picture with a Mariam Bibi from an associate nation, or Soner in Tipok standing shoulder to shoulder against a Mithali Raj or a Jhulan Goswami. They're all stalwarts of the game, but you would potentially not know the name of a Soner in Tipok. She served Thailand with diligence, with excellence over years, and we did speak a lot about Meg Lanning, who retired a few days ago, but Soner in Tipok, the former Thailand captain, also called time on her international career earlier this year, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, but the media coverage is not so much existent around a Soner in Tipok as there is for Meg Lanning. And we know the reasons, right? Because the women's game in Australia is there. You know, it has the history. There are documentaries out there for people to read. There's literature available at the ready. But hey, I work in media in India. How many documentaries on women cricketers exist in the market? According to my research, none. So people out there waiting to commission women's cricket documentaries, you have somebody waiting on this panel to back that opportunities. And there are storytellers out there with the expertise, with the diligence that is required to go in depth. I did champion the cause of social media. I will also champion the cause of long-form storytelling, because while there is an audience for short-form content, there is an audience for in-depth coverage as well, which is why the ICC hires lots of storytellers to create features, documentaries, tournament films. Watch those, understand the narratives of these players, their backgrounds, their support systems, and try to make use of all of those resources available to break more taboos. The fact that we've mainstreamed or still trying to mainstream the conversation around menstruation. Rajasthan Royals had a Joss Butler a couple of years ago do a video, an in-depth video, again, social media being the vehicle of dissemination, talk about menstruation, the conversations he has with his family members, female family members. That's important. So not only do you need female cricketers to champion their own cause, you need male cricketers too. And that's where an R. Ashwin talking about watching say a Rajeshwari Gaikwad bowl very well against Australia during a bilateral series makes a lot of difference on his YouTube channel called Kutti Stories, which means short stories with millions of followers. When you have a Virat talking about the other players, it matters. Everyone talking, you and I talking on this panel matters. So every little drop in the ocean does matter eventually. And the more we see, eventually it all comes down to visibility. Give them the platform to be visible. I was so surprised, and surprised in a good way, to see a hoarding next to the C-Link from the WPL of one of the sponsors, Amul, with Harleen Diol, Anjali Sarvani, all India players, still there. It was put up during the WPL, and now it is flanked by South African men's team hoardings and the Sri Lankan men's team hoardings, because Amul also happens to be the sponsors of those. The fact that the WPL ad featuring those India women cricketers featuring Amul as a brand is still there is heartening. Somebody take it off by now. The season 2 is about to begin, for God's sake, but it does tell you a story. Somebody will watch that. The best buses in Mumbai, which have been taken off the ground, the fleet no longer exists, they had women cricketers' faces plastered all over. A graffiti as high as a 3-story building was taking pride of place in one of the most busy suburbs, busy city centers in Mumbai in the lead up to the WPL, with Natalie, the England all-rounder, Harmanpreet Kaur, and Hayley Matthews, if I'm not mistaken. The more you see such sites, the better it is. And guess who is adorning the same wall right now? A certain Mr. Sachin Tendulkar.
So, very, very well articulated. I want to say this, I think the women players themselves are the best ambassadors and the best influencers. If you look at let me narrate 2 or 3 stories, because I do agree with you that stories are the best way of getting this out. Let me narrate one story from the history of the Tata Group and one story from Tata WPL. In the history of the Tata Group, many, many years ago, 100 years ago, we had Lady Meherbai Tata, who was married to Dorabji Tata. And she was a tennis champion of her age. She won more than 60 tennis tournaments. But the story around her is that she always played tennis wearing the Indian sari, because she was very, very proud of her Indian heritage. And that story has kind of captured the imagination of people of what could be done for women's sport. And she was also drawn to play at the 1924 Paris Olympics. But coming closer to Tata WPL and what happened here, I was at Ahmedabad recently, where Smriti Mandhana was addressing school children about building confidence among school children. And there was a very nice event where I was present as well. And you could see the way young girls from schools in Ahmedabad were relating to what Smriti Mandhana was saying from the dais. Not only did they applaud her, they asked her questions, but she was like a role model speaking to all of them. At the end of that session, I actually walked up to Smriti and she had just come back from winning the gold at the Asian Games, where the Indian women's team had won the gold. And more and more women role models like her coming through sport, I think, are hugely motivating and encouraging for young girls and young women in our country. I asked her, what stood out for you when you won the Asian Games gold? And she had just one answer for me. She said, what stood out was when the Indian flag went up, I felt so much pride. And that's the pride, I'm sure, that every young girl and every young boy in our country wants to feel. That's what women role models can do for the country. But third, I want to narrate a third story of the kind of impact Tata WPL has had, which I think has been transformative for women's sport in this country. I live in an apartment building in Parel called Ashok Towers. We have about 400 or 500 apartments in that building. And after WPL, the apartment building themselves organized a cricket league for women within our apartment. And we had women from across our flats coming and play cricket. Right in the evening, I used to see everyone out there practicing. We have a small ground within the building, and we had all the women out there practicing, wanting to be like the women players we had seen at Tata WPL. So those are the stories, I think, which bring out the transformative impact. And both at the D.Y. Patil Stadium in Navi Mumbai, where I was there for the opening match, and at Brabon for the finals, the stadiums were jam-packed. You know, like you were saying, the demand for tickets, I could feel the demand for tickets was very clearly there in the stadiums. So I do believe that the women players, whether it's Lady Meherbai Tata, whether it's Smriti Mandhana, or all the players who played at Tata WPL, they are the true role models and the true influencers. They can influence what a lot of young India does.
Yeah, it's absolutely wonderful. And there were a couple of points that have just been made in sort of the last bits of commentary, so I'm going to come to sort of Natalie first. And one of those was, Annesha, you talked to the importance of the men and the male support of the game, and sort of really kind of sort of doubling down and sort of backing the game. There's been lots of sort of conversation around, you know, when I look to kind of, you know, the country that I'm from, in sort of the UK and the 100, and kind of the separation out of its coverage and the impact, and should they go down that route, how, because Australia did with sort of the BBL, and therefore the differentiation in audience, the audience is sort of dropping off. Is it good to have space in the sport itself, or is it more kind of beneficial to kind of have it together? Now, Nasser Hussain, relative to women's cricket in the UK, basically came out and said the thing that was missing was the women's element to the game, and the TV ratings had sort of dropped off. So I'd love to kind of hear, Natalie, from your perspective, the importance of men backing sort of women's sport, but also, is there merit to the sport sort of sitting in its own ecosystem, or actually being sort of brought together so that things can kind of play out at the same time?
Yeah, Nessa's comments came obviously when the Commonwealth Games was going on last year. That's why the Women's 100 started a bit later, because they had the Commonwealth Games going on. And the year before, I mean, it was a lot sort of played in isolation in many ways, because we were still within COVID and the restrictions and all of that. But the year before, the inaugural 100 year was so successful. And one of the reasons it was successful was the women's competition and what it actually brought to the 100. The next year, the women were playing in the Commonwealth Games, so their part in the competition was delayed by about a week or so. And Nasser Hussain said the competition doesn't feel the same as last year. And the reason it didn't feel the same as last year is because you get that, obviously, that opportunity to have the double header. You get the women's competition first, and then you get the men's playing after that. And we saw the crowds coming in for the 100, not just for the men's game. They were coming in for the women's game as well. It wasn't a case of, all right, well, we're getting this, we're going to just come in for the men's game, or maybe halfway through the women's. They were coming in for the start of the women's game. So that was hugely successful, and there was a difference when the women's game wasn't there. And hearing the comment obviously coming from a woman, I think people would have maybe stood up and said, yeah, we agree. But hearing it from somebody like Nasser Hussain, one is obviously very well known as a commentator, but also former England captain, and somebody who is a big supporter of the women's game, it makes a big difference. And it causes a ripple effect all the way through. And I think it makes people stand up and listen. I think eventually I'm hoping that it gets to a point where it doesn't have to come from a male or female, obviously, in the future, that it just comes from somebody who knows the game and is an expert on the game. But a standalone tournament, I think it depends on the tournament itself. The WBBL has been hugely successful in Australia, and even when they have separated and given its own sort of identity and personality, it's still been hugely successful, and players still want to go and play in the WBBL. The coverage has been excellent, and the BBL then has its own sort of standalone. We've seen from, as you mentioned, from the Women's T20 World Cups, what has happened since it's been separated from the men's. It has just actually just exploded. So I think it is really dependent within the competition. I don't think it's necessarily going to say, this is the right model, this is the wrong model. I think the important thing is to make sure that we have a concentration on the women's tournament, and it's not just something that is piggybacking on the men's. You're still giving it its own personality, which they have done with the 100. The coverage is so good. The promotion of it is so good. We've had the first full auction as well with the women's too, and it's given an opportunity to make sure that the women's 100 has obviously got its own way forward. And I think people can either go and choose and say, all right, well, I might only watch the men's game, or I might only watch the women's game, or I can get a dosage of both. It works there. And I think it works separately as well, like the WBBL and BBL.
Dhiraj, the other point that was kind of referenced was sort of talking to some of the parallels around kind of the Rugby World Cup, the FIFA Women's World Cup that has happened. Earlier in the conversations that have been had today have been talking about kind of the growth of the sport and getting the sport into new kind of markets. We've talked to sort of Afghanistan and Holland. How do you see the impact of the WPL and kind of that creating that ripple effect with other markets that aren't necessarily fully established sort of cricketing nations?
Well, first of all, I'd like to talk of the impact that WPL has had in India. I mean, if you look at when IPL started, so IPL championed or pioneered the league culture in India. And so after the success of the IPL, you had the hockey league, the football league, and other sports which are always fighting and coming second, kabaddi to cricket. And except for badminton and table tennis, we did not have a league exclusively for women. With WPL coming in, now I know there are talks of having other leagues for women as well, because suddenly everyone's realized that there is an appetite for sport. I know this cricket matters, but thanks to cricket, the other sports are also getting popularity and will generate the same kind of interest, and leagues will flourish. Now, confidentially, what's happening in other countries is I know that each country is trying to do a league, IPL-based league, and if you see the current 2-3 countries which have put in their proposal for leagues, the first thing is men and women. It's not just been men. Most countries, like you look at Big Bash, you look at IPL, you look at the Pakistan Super League, any cricket, it's been the men's. And then based on the success, they've said, okay, now let's think if we can start a women. But the new leagues that are starting, in their tender process, it's very clear, men and women. So they know that there's already this kind of growth in women's sport. And I think that's what WPL has done. With the success of this league, Ireland, Scotland, Holland, some African countries, it'll be a combined league.
Okay. We're nearing the end of this session, so I'm going to ask each of you for one statement that kind of sums up the compelling reason for brands, media, people with families to kind of get in and get behind sort of women's cricket, the WPL more broadly.
Well, I think it's one of the things that I was actually probably told by Mel Jones, which many of you know, is you can't be what you can't see. So if we put it out there and show women what they can do, it'll just only get bigger and better. And we've seen the game getting more professional. It's just going to get better. So it's important to get eyes on it and make sure that people can see the game itself. And then from there, it'll just keep growing.
I love that.
For me, it's the right thing to do for the sport and the right thing to do for the community. And therefore, it requires all our backing.
For me, it's just the passion. I've seen the passion up front, close with the recognition that the women get in sports. So it's just very different from what happens in the men's sport.
Visibility matters, and each of us in this room have the potential to be enablers. So let's do our bit, watch more women's sport, allow more commissions for women's stories being told, and see the magic happen, because this is the time. It's now or never really, because the journey has begun and it will only go from strength to strength. Not only will you have a New York Times covering a Women's Premier League first press conference, not only will you have a variety writing about the Women's Premier League auction rights sales on the eve of the announcement of the Oscar nominations, It's staggering. Somebody sat in the US is reporting on the Women's Premier League. That tells you certain things about the change in dynamics, the change in narrative. And this is a great time to be part of the women's sport ecosystem, especially women's cricket.
Well, thank you to the panelists. I mean, super highly informed, passionate, and yeah, here's to the future.